Okay, it looks like most of those who have signed up have joined us. Again, my name is Stephan Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program at UCSD's School of Global Policy and Strategy. During lockdown, we decided we would move virtually and start to provide this webinar series partly as a way of keeping ourselves sane. For those of you who are not in the UCSD community and are logging on for the first time, let me just say a word about what the School of Global Policy and Strategy is. We offer a number of degree programs, but the two that are most relevant for our purposes today are the Masters of International Affairs, which has a Korea specialization, and our Masters of Public Policy. And we have some mid-career programs as well. So those of you who are interested in studying Korea in the context of the Asia Pacific, you might be interested in looking at the kind of education we offer here at GPS. Let me go right to the main event today. This is probably going to be our last session, though I encourage you to keep abreast of what we post on the Korea webinar page. The motive for holding this session was these two, or Michael, correct me on this, 3 disappearances of Kim Jong Un over the course of 2020, each for about 2 weeks. And they fueled this somewhat feverish speculation about whether he was alive or dead. And of course, no one really knew for certain. But what we want to do is look behind that to the question first of what would happen were Kim Jong Un to pass from the scene. What would succession look like? But at a deeper level, we also want to probe the question of how the North Korean political system is structured. It's extremely difficult and complex system to understand. It has a lot of sui generis elements, but as we'll see, they're not all sui generis, and there's certainly things we can understand about how autocracies work. So let me introduce our panel. Curtis, if you can put that other slide back up again, please. Thanks. We'll start off with Mike Madden. I've known Mike for a number of years. I draw on the resources that he puts up. He's the founder of North Korea Leadership Watch, which is one of the most sophisticated efforts to track and monitor and interpret what the North Korean leadership is doing. He also has a position at the Stimson Center and has written for 38 North, which is a really indispensable source for those of you who are doing things on North Korea, as you probably know. Next, we're going to turn to Dan Pinkston, who's a professor at Troy University. He's actually a UCSD GPS Ph.D. He's written extensively on North Korea on the missile program. Recently, he's written some pieces for NK News and for the National Interest, one with me on some of the issues surrounding the succession, focusing in on the Politburo. And I think tomorrow he has a piece which is dropping at NK News, which looks at the Central Military Commission, the CMC, which is obviously another focal point of the military leadership in the country in particular. And finally, Joseph Wright is a professor at Penn State University. He has a recent book with Barb Geddes and Erica France, which is, I think, one of the best things on how dictatorships work, which is called How Dictatorships Work. But I think I first got to know his work on North Korea when he submitted something to the Journal of East Asian Studies on personalism in North Korea, which I thought was an excellent treatment of North Korea in the comparative perspective, looking at how it's stacked up with China and Vietnam and other communist systems. Mike, why don't you lead us off? Take about 7 to 10 minutes. Let me just close with the protocol before we get started. If you have a question for our panelists, feel free to use the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring that function, and I'll get in and we'll take questions as they come up if appropriate, and if not, we'll hold them to the Q&A and then we'll have a discussion. We're planning on having about 30 minutes of discussion following the presentations. Mike?
So I'm going to speak a little bit about the current North Korean political culture and environment, what we know in very general terms, certain dynamics, and maybe pose a couple of questions and answers at the end about succession and how North Korea currently in 2020, June 2020, is handling succession. Now, when we look at succession, we have to look at it as a matter of national security decision-making. And the decision-making capacities and organizations in North Korea after 10 years of Kim Jong Un have changed. And how do we know that? Well, they have the Politburo is repopulated. They have these meetings. They have active meetings. There's formalization. That is to say, North Korea can issue a decision, some sort of decision, and you can track it from the supreme leadership to the government, to the military, to the party. Now, that's relative transparency in a very opaque regime. And that's a pretty significant change that we've seen in the last 10 years. These are things that we would not have seen necessarily under Kim Jong Il. His power was derived from being opaque, from being mysterious to a certain extent. And so when we look at that, when we look at decision making, we would think that, well, now that Kim Jong Un has a Politburo, has CMC meetings, has party congresses, are the people in those power organizations, are they decision makers? Are they policy makers, or are they people that implement those decisions? The answer is, as we saw with yesterday's Politburo meeting, is that a lot of decisions are made before these meetings even happen. And the meeting is just an opportunity for Kim Jong Un to listen to advice, listen to debates, and listen to new ideas. But when they have these political meetings, they've already decided. You can tell because Kim Jong Un walks in with this briefing book and basically tells the Politburo, this is the way it's going to be. What we don't know, and what we should have to work on the next time succession becomes a media question or becomes a media issue, is to think about ways in which Kim Jong Un is making those decisions, and how is he getting advice, and who is he getting advice from? Is it from Politburo members? Is it from the Central Committee? Or is it from a group of people or organization within his personal office that we don't see? And that's a very fundamental question. And that's a fundamental question when you're talking about succession, because the people that we may not see might be the ones that are determining issues around succession and transition. Now, when we look at dynamics, and we're considering succession, you say, well, Kim Jong Un has to go and get the support of elites. He needs elite support in order to make a decision. So he makes a decision, he needs elite support behind that. And that would certainly be applicable to succession. But the dynamic, after 10 years of Kim Jong Un, the dynamic of this kind of decision making is that these guys we see in the Politburo or the CMC, they are expendable. And how do we know that? Because of churn. There is churn in the system. And you have to go no further than the years 2013 to 2017 and look at the leading officials of the Korean People's Army High Command. And what do you have? You have 3 or 4 different ministers of defense, ministers of the armed forces. You have churn with the chief of the General Staff Department. Okay? And this is a way of policing the elites and keeping them on their toes. That no individual in the regime is sacred, that no individual in the regime can't be done away with or dismissed. We've seen this year with Ri Men-gon. Ri Men-gon, one of the top officials in North Korea, he led nuclear missile testing in 2017, became the director of the powerful organization guidance department, but in February of this year was taken down a peg by Kim Jong Un. So it just shows that somebody, even at the pinnacle of power in the core leadership, that no one's safe. Now, that's the negative. The positive is that within political organizations, within these venues for decision-making and policy deliberation, Kim Jong Un has put in his own people. Now, that is sort of a superficial analysis when we're evaluating current events, when we evaluate an SPA session or a Politburo meeting. He's always putting in his own people. What does that mean? It means that there are people whose careers he has made in the regime, brought them up into high office, and so they are going to be bound to his decisions, whether they effectually support them or not. And there are 2 officials I'd point out when we're looking at the official, the trajectory of officials' careers. One from the party side is the guy named Pak Tae-song. Now, if we go to North Korean state media, no one had heard of Pak Tae-song. I mean, obviously his wife had heard of him and people he works with had heard of him, but nobody had really heard of Pak Tae-song as a policymaker or as an advisor to Kim Jong Un until about the year 2013 when he was appointed deputy director in the Central Committee. He was later appointed to the provincial party boss of South Pyongan province, where he supervised, his key task was to supervise the development of missile engines. and he seemed to have been successful. Now he's been brought up to the center. He's been brought up to what could be termed a core leadership position as the head of the science and education portfolio within the Executive Policy Bureau, formerly known as the Secretariat. So this is a figure that we could see 10 years of Kim Jong Un and 10 years of this guy's career being made. And so this is a man that's going to be loyal to a decision, whether he effectually supports it or not. Another person we would look at is Vice Marshal Park Chung-chan. Now, for some reason, at the last CMC meeting a few weeks ago, Kim Jong Un decided to bring back that old honorific appellation, the Vice Marshal title. And so what do we see? Park Chung-chan again. And it's very difficult to track North Korean military commanders or general grade officers, but Park Chung-chan is somebody, again, that does not appear in state media, is not somebody really in the eyes or ears of external observers until Kim Jong Un takes over. And so what do you see? You see Park Chung-chan, anonymous official, maybe he's in the Supreme Command, gets upgraded to the Artillery Command. Then with the churn dynamic in North Korean leadership these days, he's busted down. He disappears for 6 months or a year, and he's presumed, as usual, purged. But he emerges again, a commander of the artillery, until he's upgraded in August, chief of the general staff. This is a Kim Jong Un person. And so this is somebody, again, that's going to pledge his loyalty to Kim Jong Un's decision-making, and that's something he can control. Now, one of the, I think, questions we're looking at with succession right now is, I think some basic questions would be to look at, does North Korea have a succession mechanism? Is there a succession? There is, yes. There's a succession and transition mechanism. I think as North Korea watchers, whether we're professional North Korea watchers or we just like to follow this stuff at home, we should be asking the question, what does that succession entail? And what is the difference between succession, hereditary succession, and transition? Transition, continuity of government, continuity of control is a separate matter altogether. So we should probably be looking, when we ask the question about succession, are we looking at an aspirational process where we've picked a successor and we're going to do what we need to do to get that successor into the top spot in the leadership? Or are we looking at a transition, which is to say that the leader of North Korea is debilitated or dead, and we need to maintain the continuity of the regime? North Korea, in my estimation, has a lot of this stuff down. They have it in books, okay? And how do we know that? Well, Kim Jong Un succeeded his father, and that was a edge of your seat, bite your fingernails, quick succession. And so when we're looking at that, as I said, we need to divide, I think, between succession and transition. And then I'll sort of conclude, well, where do we look when we're looking at succession? If something happens, if there's a new leadership formation, who would it be? The obvious answer is Kim Yo Jong at the head of a collective leadership. Now, we, maybe not right now, while we know Kim Jong Un's alive and relatively healthy, but I think as we go forward, we're going to need to ask ourselves, who is going to be part of the collective leadership that is behind Kim Yo Jong? And how are those people, where are they coming from? Are they part of the current leadership, or are they people we haven't seen? And I'll let it go there so I don't suck all the time.
Mike, as always, your analysis is just great. And I really like your point about the expendability of personnel in these types of systems. And that is an element of control. But if I can just, in the spirit of having a bit of a conversation here, ask you one question. Do you believe that everyone in the leadership is expendable?
No, I don't think. Oh, sorry,
like
sir.
Kim Jong-un, someone like that. Is there anyone who is, in some sense, more insulated because of the depth of their connections to the system or to the family?
Yeah, I don't think that, I wouldn't say that everybody is expendable. I think there are certain figures in the current leadership alignment that aren't expendable. I would point, as you just mentioned, Cho Young-hae. Cho Young-hae's had every top job other than supreme leader in the regime. He is a princeling like Kim Jong-un. Right. That's another trend that we don't really talk about. There's a lot of princelings and ties to the core elite that have come forward under Kim Jong-un. Another person, and this might be slightly controversial, I don't think is expendable, is Kim Yong-chol. I think Kim Jong-chol is kept around not only for his patronage and career ties, but also because he's somebody that can give Kim Jong Un creative and candid advice. And so what we have to do is we have to learn more. Even I have to learn more about some of these other people to sort of determine whether they are expendable or not. But a lot of these guys, and expendable might be a harsh word, but people can get moved to other positions.
No, I don't think expendable is harsh at all. I think it analytically makes sense. Dan, I think this leads directly into the type of things that you and I have been talking about. So why don't I pass the baton to you and take 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks to the Korea Pacific program. It's great to be back, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. Great to see everyone. I think, Steph, you're winning the bookshelf battle hands down, but good to see you. I just wanted to make some brief remarks to any aspiring dictators out there, or those who study them, or analysts who look at dictatorships and authoritarian systems. So I would say for any dictatorship, there are 4 things you need to establish, control, and maintain control of. First is the guns. Second is the money. Third is information. And 4th is society. So you need to seize control of those 4 dimensions to establish your dictatorship and to sustain it. Now, in the North Korean case, and I think this is relevant or similar with other authoritarian regimes, I think in North Korea, there are 2 features that are critical for the stability of the regime and any succession process. I think the Kim family regime has been very adept, very efficient at controlling those 4 dimensions. They're really great dictators, and I don't mean that in the sense that I like or admire dictatorships as a system of governance, but I say it in the sense that we should not underestimate their ability to maintain control and to sustain the regime. Now, those 2 critical features of the North Korean system, one is cognitive or ideological, and what the North Koreans call ideology, so I use that term. It's very, very important to the regime. They mention that all the time. If you read the literature, they say that is most important, and they focus on that, particularly in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the famine. And then secondly is the institutional dimension to maintain control of those 4 lines. So according to the North Korean literature, the narrative about the revolutionary exploits of the Kims and the Kim family, generation after generation, that whole narrative that establishes the legitimacy of the regime. We see little slivers of that externally. It's mostly crafted for the domestic audience, but we see that in the party bylaws, the constitutional preamble, literature, the curriculum in schools, mass media, broadcast media, and so forth. Then on the institutional side, well, excuse me, let me back up for a second. On that cognitive ideological feature, according to that narrative, only the Ph.D. bloodline, the Kim family bloodline, is eligible for rule and leadership. So in that case, Kim Yo Jong is very well positioned to succeed her brother if in fact he were unable to rule. But she faces some obstacles because of the patriarchy and the youth, and people question whether or not a woman would be able to lead the North Korean system because of sexism. So she has some strikes against her. And then on the institutional side, you don't necessarily have to be a Kim or part of the Kim family bloodline to seize control of those institutions. So that includes the party, the military, the security institutions, the state, and the mass organization. So that's a very complex map, organizational map. We can talk about that in the discussion, but I'll leave it at that and be ready to take any questions.
Dan, that was great. I particularly like the way you outline these 4 dimensions of control. And of course, it's interesting that each of those corresponds with a piece of the actual institutional structure, the CNC and the money probably being the least transparent of that. And I think we'll come back to that, because one insight that Dan had in the conversation with me is that control of foreign assets held by the regime, it's most likely that that is in the hands of family, because that's where trust is in some ways most fundamental. I'll be curious to see if Mike agrees with that when we pick it back up. Joe, why don't you go for 10 minutes, and then we're starting to get a few questions in. If anyone does have questions, feel free to forward them, and we'll ask them as they come in. Joe?
Great, thanks, Steph. I appreciate the chance to be here to chat about the North Korean succession, and particularly the chance to be with these colleagues of mine who I've learned a lot about North Korea from. So I appreciate the chance, even if only for through Zoom, to meet you all. So I'm not the North Korean expert here. I am I know a little bit about a lot of places in a study of dictatorships, and look for general patterns from historical data to help us understand how dictatorships come to power and how they sustain their rule. And of course, succession, political succession, leadership succession is central to both of those questions. So let me start off by just saying that the North Korean regime, to my mind, having looked at lots of dictatorships over the course of my career, is relatively unique insofar as it's a personalist dictatorship that in itself is not particularly unique, but it's also very long-lived, and it's solved the leadership succession problem twice now. And that's what makes it quite unique. What is a personalist dictatorship? Well, the way I think about this and the theory behind it comes that there's really two organizational groups that have the potential. This builds on some of the stuff that Daniel was articulating. There are two groups out there that the leader has to contend with for power amongst elites, and those are the political party and the military. And so a personalist leader is one who basically has more power over other elites in those institutions relative to other dictatorships. And so this paradigm, or this way of thinking about dictatorships, is actually quite useful for the North Korean case because you do have very distinct militaries. Not all dictatorships have. Post-colonial things can sometimes have weird militaries. And not every dictatorship has a party, particularly a would-be Leninist party. And this framework is helpful to think about when you do have an established military and political party. So what does that entail to have personalist regime? As alluded to by both of my colleagues who spoke before, things like a history of successful purges of elites who might hold or form independent power bases and grab power back from the leader. A history of making, sort of keeping elites in check. And there's a number of ways to do this. One is to create loyalty appointments where your career, and indeed sometimes your life and the economic rents that come from your career, depend upon your personal relationship with the leader. So a great example of this would be, presumably the leader's blood relatives would have very little career outside of that leader. And so they're having an incentive to invest in the survival of that leader. Another way we could do this is as Michael referred to as the churn of elites, or the continual purging over time of elites, and then bringing them back as well at various points to keep them off balance. And the third, which can be very expensive, is organizational proliferation. You creating new organizations to sort of guard the other organizations. And we see loyalty appointments as well as sort of the purge of elites, or the churn over time of elites in the North Korean case. And so it fits, the behaviors fit this kind of dictatorship quite, behaviors of the North Korean leader fit this dictatorship quite well. Okay, two patterns that I want to talk about generally about how succession works in these places. First of all, it's tough. It's tougher than anywhere else, precisely because the institutions oftentimes are weaker and are unable to coordinate expectations for those they leave behind when they do leave office. That is, other elites they leave behind. So historically, the pattern is that personalist leaders are more likely to either die in office from old age, again, the North Korean example exemplifies this, or to leave office violently, including violent death. The counterpart to that is that they're less likely to leave office peacefully. They're less likely to step down in sort of a succession between party elites, as for example might happen in Vietnam, or they're very unlikely to step down peacefully when the regime loses power in an election or in the face of a mass uprising, protest uprising. So how they leave power is different than other dictatorships, and it's typically not good in a normative way. Secondly, what happens when they do leave power? Well, when leaders, personalist leaders leave power, the regimes tend to end quite quickly. That is, very few dictatorships outlast their sort of founding dictator, that personalist dictator, unless they establish other kinds of mechanisms within the party or within the military to solve the leadership succession problem. Monarchies are sort of a slightly different category there, but the North Korean regime, as some have suggested, fits sort of a monarchical succession culture, if you will, given the precedent there. Okay, so typically when the leader leaves office, the regime ends quickly and oftentimes in violence. And so that's what makes the Kim regime quite unique, because it's personalist and long-lived and has actually solved that leadership succession, even though the leader himself has substantial power over other organizations like the political party and the military. Okay, as has been noted, the first leadership succession was solved in 1994. And that's interesting from my perspective, because those are real bad times in 1994. So that's a hard time to sort of sustain a regime given what was going on in North Korea in 1994. But they were successful, and in part because that leadership succession plan had been in place for a long time. You know, some might date that to 1974. And so that's a good 20 years of being able to coordinate, for elites to coordinate on the rent distribution network, on who's going to control that network going forward after the leader dies. And when you have that succession place in power for that long, that's helpful. And that's actually why sometimes you see in other parties, Leninist party, former Leninist or would-be Leninist parties, you see appointment happen, sort of the successor is named well prior to the actual appointment as the successor, or when the successor comes to office. And that's precisely to allow there to be a lot of time for people to coordinate on a new sort of center of the rent network. And so that was quite helpful in 1994 because there was a long time there. And my guess is a big part of the instability around the second succession was that there was much less time to re-coordinate around a new rent network. Not necessarily a new network, but a new center of the network. And indeed, at the time, commentators observed that the leader's uncle would in fact be the center of that network, and it turned out he wasn't, and that was quickly decided with a purge. Okay, so that's sort of how things sort of the North Korean regime fits into sort of the broader context. Let me make a couple of comments about the different scenarios that have been mentioned here as to what could come next in succession. Collective leadership afterwards. I've seen this mentioned and heard it with my colleagues mentioned it earlier in this podcast. This is really tough to do in a personalist regime. It's very difficult to do because there's no way for power sharing agreements between the elites to be enforced. So they can come up with all the agreements they want, but there's very few mechanisms, precisely because those mechanisms have been destroyed or dependent on the individual of the leader to be able to adjudicate power sharing disagreements. Transparency is incredibly important as well for power sharing agreements to be enforced. In short, because you want to be able to, if you're going to have a power sharing agreement that works in collective leadership, you're going to want transparency about the size of the pie, how much rent is there to go around, and who's getting what at what time. And when those things are transparent, it becomes much easier to survive a long time with a collective rule and some sort of power sharing agreement amongst the members of that collective. Without those things, without that kind of transparency, it becomes much more difficult to sustain, and it's much more likely to disintegrate into some sort of violence. And when I say violence, I don't even mean violent upheaval with different armed groups fighting each other. What I mean is elites going after each other violently and purging. And sometimes that can look like a coup, and sometimes that's just a purge that is oftentimes hidden from our view, as in the case of the Kim regime. A second scenario that I've seen bandied about is that there could another strongman could emerge, or a strong woman perhaps, in this case. And again, if that does emerge, then what we'd expect to see is similar to what we would see in the prior transition to Kim Jong Un, where we see a quick series of purges of other elites until the strong man or strong woman possesses a key cadre of loyal agents whose careers depend on him or her, and who don't have alternative sources of power, and who can't easily act together to oust him or her. And then, for the North Korean context, of course, if a new non-familial strongman emerges, then the question then becomes, how do you sustain legitimacy based on the ideology, as Daniel was pointing out. So those are the main sort of insights, I guess, that I could share today about how the North Korean case might fit into some of the larger trends that we know from studying lots and lots of dictatorships historically.
Joe, that was terrific, and thanks to our panel. This was really wonderful. Before turning to Sambo, who works as the leadership of our Korea organization here at GPS, I wanted to come back to Mike and Dan, actually all of you, to just help clarify for our audience a little bit more about the family dynamics in this setting. Dan made some comments about how Kim Yo Jong is in some ways within the family, the next in line. But we have a questioner asking about any other surviving half siblings or other relatives that could somehow grab on to the Pek-tu bloodline, as Dan called it. Mike, can you give us a little bit of an empirical overview of where are the family members situated? Do any of them have the ability to rise to the top? And are there others who might even appear as challengers, and even challengers sponsored from the outside? That discussion that took place earlier before some of those purported challengers were actually eliminated from the roster.
Well, when we're looking at other people in the family, in the ruling family, there are two names that'll pop out. The first is Kim Jong-chol. That name still surfaces around. It's surfaced around for almost 15 years. He was first introduced as a possible hereditary successor around the year 2005, but that might have been just a push for the descendants or the sons of Ko Young-hui, the mother of Kim Jong Un and Yo Jong, to be placed to become hereditary successors. But Jung Chol's name surfaces. It surfaces in unconfirmed rumors and people that send you little text messages saying, oh, I just heard something interesting. It surfaces. His name surfaces. He's been linked to the OGD, to the Organization Guidance Department. He has been linked to some of the foreign currency generating operations. And most famously, about 10 years ago, he was one of the leading figures in North Korea's Brat Pack, which intelligence analysts decided to call the Punghwa Joe, or the Torch Group. So he's been linked to the Brat Pack of North Korean elites, the children of North Korean officials. But his roles and responsibilities are unknown. The best speculative case you can make around Kim Jong-chol is that Jong-chol is probably one of his brother's advisors. He can probably talk to Kim Jong-un. And who knows if he has portfolios on which he advises KJU. The other person whose name kind of disappeared over the last few years is Kim Sol-song. Kim Sol-song was born in 1974. She is the oldest child of Kim Jong-il's official wife, the official wife being the one that Kim Il-sung picked for his son back in the 70s. And Kim Sol-song is a very sophisticated operator. She has a husband who's a senior official in the Organization Guidance Department. And Sol-song did a lot of the same jobs for Kim Jong-il that we've associated now with Kim Yo Jong and Kim Jong Un. So for a number of years, Kim Sol-song was the one that directed the events, or directed #1 events, directed these appearances that the supreme leader makes. And so she's very much involved with things like the guard command and bodyguards, and she knows a lot of very interesting details. I don't know if Sol-song has been sidelined. Her name just doesn't show up as much as it used to be. Or if again, like Kim Jong-chol, if she just serves as sort of a family-style kitchen cabinet, where Kim Jong-un has a lot of issues and things he needs to discuss, but he can't really trust an outer circle of advisors. So he might call upon institutional memory and experience of people that he's related to, such as Kim Sol-song. Sol-song is a name to watch. And if people want to get crazy into the speculation, Kim Sol-song has a son who is just out of college right now. So if people are going to be looking for succession, for hereditary succession, there might be grandchildren of Kim Jong-il that might come in and try to take the big title.
Well, look, you went directly to two figures who I don't monitor in the least. But can you just step back for a sec, Mike, and say something about Kim Yo Jong and how you read her position? Because in addition to the family, she's obviously taken on more visible official roles. How do you see that in the context of any discussion of succession? Do you think it's possible that she could actually hold such a position?
With Kim Yo Jong, Kim Yo Jong's moved on from directing the events. That goes to Hyun Sung Wall. She's the one that does it now. Kim Yo Jong seems to have migrated into a very sensitive position. The speculation is she's the lead in the organization guidance department, but the critical detail here is that she runs her brother's personal secretariat. And what does that mean? She runs the foreign money that gets delivered to Kim Jong Un on the holidays, and she knows how to, she knows the nuclear launch codes and all that stuff. That's how high she is. Now, without, giving away the whole story about Kim Yo Jong, I think Kim Yo Jong is positioned as somebody that could be a transitional figure, possibly for many years, possibly if there is a contingency with the current supreme leader, that she could step in and be a transitional figure. But my experience thinking about Kim Yo Jong's, the entirety of her career and her biography, is that she is putting herself, and her brother is putting her, in the position of becoming the eminence grise in the regime. And that position was last held by Jang Sung-taek. I think she's probably derives a lot more power being somebody like Jang Sung-taek, right, who has what seems to be a second-tier position, senior deputy director, right, but she's in all of the meetings. And I think that's where she's being positioned. I mean, the difference between Jang Sung-taek and Kim Yo Jong is that Jang Sung-taek was very ambitious and he wasn't a blood relative. Kim Yo Jong, as Daniel had spoken about, she's a direct descendant of the Paek-Tusan bloodline. And so that's a critical detail. And that's what makes her a main branch and not a side branch in North Korean family politics.
Right. And those terms, main branch and side branch, for those of you who watch North Korea, are terms of art, in terms of how close you are to the actual bloodline. Sam, do you have something you'd like to ask? And if not, we can go on, but please do.
Hi, sure. So first I want to say thank you to Michael, Dan, and Joe for being here. I was really excited for this topic today. So my question, actually, Michael kind of just touched on. I wanted to know why you think the public has gravitated toward the idea of Kim Yo Jong succeeding Kim Jong Un rather than Kim Jong Chol. So you kind of touched on that. So I will instead ask, do you think that Kim Yo Jong poses a potential threat to Kim Jong Un since she's been rising in power? And is there a possibility that we could eventually see a purge of her?
I would just say that I think with regard to Kim Yo Jong and Kim Jong Un, their personal relationship, I think, would mitigate any potential power conflicts between the two of them. The other thing, and this is more of a longer term trend I've noticed among at least the dynamic between Jong Un and Yo Jong, is that there's a lessons learned approach. They've taken a lot of lessons learned from the old man, from Kim Il Sung. And so Kim Yo Jong knows how to mind her P's and Q's, as they say. And I think she's somebody that that knows that you don't really challenge the supreme leader. I think the danger with an active leader, with somebody like Kim Jong Un, and this applied to Kim Il Sung back in the 1970s, is not so much a direct power challenge from the most intimate advisors and family members you have. What you actually have to worry about is co-optation or neutralization, whereby the supreme leader figure is neutralized by a powerful political aide, where the oxygen of decision making migrates from the Suryong and is sucked into somebody else. And I don't think that's something she's necessarily gonna tread. I think there's a certain degree with the Kims that it's not so much personal ambition, but that they have an idea of public service. Now that might sound perverse to external observers, but in terms of leading North Korea, they have this idea about service, and what they are doing is service. And if you go and look at some of the slogans they like to have, one of Kim Jong Un's big slogans is "We serve the people," and so what they view as public service. And I think that there's a certain virtue or certain ethics that they have that she's just not gonna violate.
Right. That actually it takes us in a somewhat different direction, because the idea of service and accountability raises these broader questions of the relationship between the leadership and North Korean society more generally. And I wanted to pose this question to Dan. It's coming from Susan. She said, is there any chance of uprising from the population and overturn from below? And I pose this question because I think most of us who study North Korea believe that this is unlikely. But as Joe in particular knows, a number of transitions from authoritarian regimes have precisely come from below. They've been mass mobilizations, typically in cities, that end up surprising leaderships. Ceausescu on the balcony being perhaps the classic example. As North Korea becomes more like a market economy underneath the surface, is it possible that you could get pressures that are emanating from below?
Well, it's possible, but it's very unlikely under the current conditions. I like to say that North Korea is the almost perfect dictatorship. And if you look at those security institutions and the degree of control, the collective action problems are tremendous. So, you mentioned Ceausescu on the balcony, and then some rumbling and some people shouted some statements, and then it kind of snowballed. But to stick your head up in North Korea, there are so many agencies and institutions of surveillance and monitoring, including the Inminban, which is the neighborhood watch group that keeps track of everyone in every apartment or area of a neighborhood. The Ministry of People Security, the party cells, the Ministry of State Security. They spend a lot of resources. I wonder what the GDP allocation is for internal security. So it's extraordinarily difficult. When I traveled to North Korea, even going to the next county, you have to have permission. There are guard checkpoints. So driving through, we would be stopped and asked for some papers or permissions, and I would see people standing there waiting to go to the other side, maybe of the county boundary, maybe to see some relatives or to deliver something. So as far as rising up, and of course what's critical is Pyongyang. So to move on to leadership, you need to co-opt a number of institutions. The Guard Command, the Pyongyang Defense Command, the RGB, maybe Corps Commander, the Ministry of State Security. You can go down a long list. And so as far as taking any steps to coordinate that effort, it's very likely that you would be discovered. And even if you're dissatisfied with the regime, let's say if I were in a place or a position that I could coordinate with a like-minded colleague and say, let's oust Kim because things are moving in a bad direction. If someone were to come to me and say that, I cannot trust you. You can't make a credible commitment in a dictatorship. I would wonder if this is a setup to expose me, and I would have so much to risk. And if you're in one of those positions, leading one of those institutions that would have the actual tools to move on the dictator, you're in a pretty good position. You're rewarded with private rewards. Hard currency, shopping trips to Beijing, you have a car, you have a good flat in Pyongyang, you have good food rations. And so why would you risk that? You know what your current position is in the rent network, as Joe was mentioning. So those people are privileged. So the barriers and the collective action problems are huge. I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, I of course agree with you totally, as you know, and I think we even tend to dismiss the role of the mass organizations. And virtually every North Korean is a member of mass organizations, which also have a surveillance function. Joe, I want to come back to one of the things that you talked about in your piece at the Journal of East Asian Studies that I found interesting, which is this whole question of the relationship between the party and the military in North Korea. And I'm sure Mike will have some things to say about this as well. One of the things we've all observed, I think, is this reinstitutionalization of party institutions, the Politburo, the Central Committee, and so on, actually meeting, appearing more like functioning bodies. But obviously, if you look at the composition of those bodies, the representation of military and security personnel is very high. And there has been this ongoing debate of whether we can really think of this as a party dominant system or whether the military at least has informal influence over the leadership. Can you speak to that puzzle?
Yeah, so there's sort of, I can think of two reasons why, for example, Kim Jong Un would want to reinvigorate party institutions. And one is simply as a check on the military. Dictators oftentimes create new political parties precisely for that reason. It's an effort to actually put down a coup, to sort of provide a buffer against a coup. And in this case, there's not creating a new party or even necessarily new organs within the party, but rather reinvigorating them and starting to use them in ways that people oftentimes, or dictators oftentimes use them, but just hadn't been under his father as much. So one is simply sort of a buffer against the military. The second is, and this is related to that, is actually can be useful, particularly if you put military elites inside those organs. It gives them gives the leader an additional mechanism to monitor their behavior. As Daniel was saying, you know, in order to sort of have an elite ousting of a leader, you need to have substantial coordination amongst those elites. And so what the leader wants to do is monitor every situation in which those elites get to talk to each other. And by sticking some of them, in fact, dividing them perhaps, I'm not sure the details, but perhaps dividing them, some are in the party organs and some are not. One is a divide and conquer strategy with respect to the military. But for those that he puts in there, it's an effort simply to monitor them. Would be one way of construing that. And so that would be, to me, the two explanations, sort of a monitoring mechanism and a buffering mechanism as to why you would stick a bunch of military elites into the party organs as you reinvigorate them.
Right. Mike, do you have anything to say on this? And let me pose the question in just a slightly different way as well. Obviously, we're interested in North Korea in part because of practical issues surrounding the nuclear and missile programs. And that raises the question of whether Kim Jong Un has a completely free hand in the pursuit of those programs, or whether to a certain extent he may be captive to the military. Dan and I were running down the Politburo membership and just looking at the bios quickly a couple of weeks ago, and it's stacked with military personnel. Now, you're right, each individual one is expendable, but maybe you need to have those military personnel there for the functions that Joe talked about. What's your take on this, Mike?
The military on the Politburo is a matter of power inclusion. If we go and look at a Politburo under Kim Jong Un, then what you're going to be looking at is you basically have slots. So the prime minister has a slot, the head of the State Security Department has a slot. Okay, so everything's sort of checked in. One of the emphases in North Korean media with the WMD test cycle is that it's under the control of the party, and that one way that Kim Jong Un might have practiced retail politics is with the positioning of Ri Pyong-chol, the former head of the Air Force, who is now the head of the MID, the Munitions Industry Department, which directs North Korea's defense industry. So what you have is inclusive politics, whereby people from the military are migrating into the party structure. Even back in the 1980s, joining the party structure from the military was considered a major ambition or goal. You wanted to do that. And so what do we look at when we look at two strategic issues, WMD testing and conventional weapons development production, and foreign policy, specifically with regard to South Korea? What are you going to see? You see two ex-senior KPA officials, high command officials, who are now the party officials in charge of it. So they have to work within the protocols and confines of the Workers' Party of Korea. They have to work through those institutions. But at the same time, military officials, the military constituency, can look at state media or look at something and say, hey, there's our guy. Our guy is not going to let Moon or Trump screw us over. Our guy is out there going to the Oval Office delivering him. Our guy is at all the missile tests, you know, hugging Kim Jong Un and smoking cigarettes with him on the floor. And so I think that's what goes on. I don't, the military itself, North Korea's military, whether Kim Jong Un was in place or not, the KPA is so divided between what particular service branch or organization they represent. What's the difference between the Navy and the Air Force, ground forces, special operations forces, strategic rocket forces? The KPA is sort of a monolith, and it's full of its own factions with their own policy priorities. So and that's one of those things we don't think about. We just think of the military, North Korea's military. We don't realize that some of these guys don't agree on anything. Back in the old KJI days, you used to see Kim Jong-il, and he used to have the three generals of the Supreme Operations, the Operations Command Group behind him, Ri Myung-soo, Hyun Chol-hae, and Park Jae-kyung. And you could see that, they're with Kim Jong-il all the time. But, you know, one guy was from the General Political Bureau, which runs the commissars. One guy was from the General Staff Department Operations Bureau. And one guy was from the Propaganda Bureau. And who's to say that they're going to agree whether the sky is gray or overcast or partly cloudy? I mean, that's one of those issues you have with the North Korean military.
Yeah, no, and that redundancy, as I think all of you have commented at various points, that redundancy in the organizational structures is partly designed to create uncertainty and coup-proof. Dan, let me come back to you about a somewhat different issue that you've written on in the past, which is the question of China's influence on this. This comes from one of our viewers asking about China's influence on this whole process. Now, if we go way back to the beginning, and Joe has written on this, there were factions within the party that were tied very closely to outside actors, both on the Chinese side and to the Soviets. But now it seems like that outside influence has really diminished substantially. Do you have a take on that, Dan?
Yes, but first I'll just say very briefly to comment the party KPA relations or military relations. The party has always been ascendant, always been in control. The military is very weak compared to the party. Any dictatorship has to worry about who is guarding the guards. And if you look at North Korea, they have mechanisms in place of guards guarding the guards who guard the guards who guard the guards who guard the guards. So as far as control of the money and the information, the military is practically neutered. And as far as seizing political control, it would be extraordinarily difficult unless there's some abrupt break in the Kim family line and they lose control. Now, as far as China, as far as any outside influence, China has the most influence.
Dan, can I just interrupt you on this? Because I really want to underline this point. You know, the fact that you know, it appears like a strong military, but we shouldn't confuse the capability of the military as a fighting force or the missile forces or the nuclear program with the political strength of the military. And I think I'm taking away from Mike and Dan a kind of convergence on this point, that organizationally, the leadership has done a very good job of making sure that the military as an organization is very difficult to act collectively for political ends. Yeah, but let me let you get back, but that was an important point I think needed to underline.
Yes, so as far as for China in enforcement of any sanctions or economic pressure or coercion, China is in the best position to exert that kind of pressure. It's generally not in China's interest to exert the kind of pressure that would cause instability in North Korea. I think everyone knows that. And as far as the relationship, despite all of the references to lips and teeth and fighting in the war and everything else, I think under the surface, it's a very adversarial relationship where there's a lot of tension in the relationship and a lot of resentment on the side of the North Koreans because they have to rely so much on China and are so dependent upon China. And so that's why they're always seeking to diversify their external links in terms of politics, diplomacy, and economic links to the outside world.
Okay, listen, the time has flown by. I'm going to put all three of you on the spot if I can. That's one of the joy of being a moderator. I don't have to answer my own questions. By asking something that may strike you as somewhat subversive, and maybe, Mike, particularly to you. So if we study the leadership closely, do we in fact gain insight on how the country behaves? So if we look at the current juncture, let's say, new tensions with the South, the nuclear issue kind of on the back burner at the moment, negotiations nowhere in sight as far as I can see, is there something about studying the leadership that will give us insight onto which way North Korea might lean going forward? And if each of you can just take a minute or two on that, we'll wrap up.
I mean, studying the leadership is more about looking, I mean, what I do anyway is about looking for more medium and long-term trends with North Korea's political culture itself and how they're going to make these decisions. When we look at what you need to do with biographical information, if we're going to take a specific North Korean official, what you would have to look at is the individual, his or herself, the position that they hold in the regime. What is that position? What do you historically know? Now, don't get weighted down like an anchor with precedents, but what is that position historically? What has it done? Has it been effective in the regime historically, currently? And then look at what the policy issue is, what the environment is, the geopolitical environment, and then the domestic environment, and see what that might be able to tell you. There's a certain, I think that if we would look at somebody like the current Minister of Foreign Trade, which they don't call foreign trade anymore, you look at somebody like Ri Yong Nam. Now, Ri Yong Nam is a princeling, but he is also somebody that served in trade attaché positions overseas before having a very long shelf life as a current North Korean official in his current job. He's a vice premier now. He's not the Minister of Foreign Trade, so he got upped. So you would have to look at and see what this man's perspective is. So, you know, if there's a policy deliberation, him talking about some sort of small-scale trade deal with Singapore, for example, is probably going to carry a lot more weight than, say, the argument on the other side of the Politburo table from somebody who's, you know, head of state security, or somebody for, you know, an OGD person. Say, well, OGD guys, you're not allowed to leave the country. What are you to tell me what we can and cannot do in Singapore? So you have to look at that. But the problem with that is, and that's just on issue by issue or policy by policy, that you could get a misleading picture. A deceptive picture, because just because somebody served overseas or has lots of foreign contacts, that kind of thing, that's not necessarily going to make them, you know, influence or affect an open up type of position from North Korea. Who's to say? For all you could say, we could say what a lot of people say about Kim Jong Un. He was outside the country for so long, but somehow he hates the outside world. So I think that's what you have to look at.
I remember that debate about it and drop off in the
Yeah.
period. We just don't learn these lessons. Dan?
Yes, I would just say briefly, since it is a personalistic dictatorship, it's a family regime, of course, you have to look at the leadership, but you have to step back sometimes and look at the necessary functions, conditions, and instruments to maintain a dictatorship. So you have to look at the individual and his close collaborators or cohorts in the regime and see if they're actually doing it. So when Kim Jong Un came to power, he was in his 20s. A lot of people speculated that there's no way, this guy's too young, he's too inexperienced. These generals with all of this experience in their 60s and 70s aren't going to listen to a 20-some-year-old guy and take orders from him. But he actually did it. So you have to keep a scoreboard, go down the checklist. Is the leader doing what he's supposed to do or what she's supposed to do to maintain the dictatorship? And you look at Kim Jong Un's performance, it was extraordinary. He's a great dictator. So, you can have the name or the family line, you can be dropped into that position, but there's actual performance and things you have to do. So yes, we look at the personnel, the people, the individuals, but then there are actual instruments of power and mechanisms they have to use to stay in power. And so far, the three Kims have done that very effectively.
Yeah, that's very astute. That's very astute. Joe, you want to wrap up for us, and then?
Yeah. So briefly, the studying the elites and who they are can be helpful insofar, from my perspective, as letting us know what the relative balance of power is between some of these institutions that allow people to act collectively, like the party or the military, perhaps maybe the party more so, but even something like the Central Military Commission. What's the relative balance of power between the leader and some of these organizations? And the more balance of power shifts towards the leader, the more likely the leader is going to make a bad decision when it comes to foreign policy. Bad meaning that it could be ultimately self-destructive. And the more power that goes to the institutions, the more likely to make solid foreign policy decisions from the perspective of the regime surviving.
Right. Wow. Well, I tell you, from my perspective, this was a master class. Just a tremendous amount of expertise here, from Michael's burrowing into the leadership to Joe's very wide-ranging knowledge of the case, and Dan being based in Seoul, watching this very closely. I just can't thank you enough for joining us, and I enjoyed this so much. I hope I can rope you into doing it again sometime in the fall. I'm sure there'll be something on the horizon that we'll need to reanalyze. Thanks, Michael Madden, Joe Wright, Dan Pinkston, and for all of us, for all of you who are joining us today. So long.